Welcome to America's Talking. I'm Cole McNeely, General Manager of America's Talking Network. The first two seasons of America's Talking featured Austin Berg having thoughtful conversations with authors, nonprofit leaders, and more. I want to both acknowledge and thank Austin for those conversations over the past 2 years. As we enter the third season of America's Talking, there are some changes. As we were considering season 3 of this program, we acknowledged the realities of America. It's a country facing real challenges that impact each and every corner of the nation. This year, we hope to help educate about those challenges, and we've teamed up with the Center Square Newswire service to do just that. The Center Square has a robust infrastructure of journalists that cover all 50 states and the national level. And each episode of America's Talking, I will host a roundtable with some of those editors and journalists from all over the country discussing how a single topic is impacting the people in those areas and what steps are being taken to address that issue. We recorded this first episode on the heels of the 2024 GOP Iowa caucus, where Republican voters considered the top issue to be immigration. We have a full barn today to talk about this. Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content of the Franklin News Foundation, is here. Dan, how you doing?
Hey, Cole, how are things? Doing well.
I'm doing well. I'm happy to have you on this, the new version of America's Talking. We've also got Northeast Regional Editor for the Center Square out of Northern Virginia. It's Sarah Roderick-Fitch. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you got snow out your way. I heard about
this.
Yes,
I did. Yes, a whole whopping 2 inches.
A whole whopping 2 inches. There you go. And 2 inches of snow probably doesn't feel like much to Derek Draplin, Western Regional Editor for the Center Square out of Denver, Colorado. Derek, thanks for coming on America's Talking this week.
Hey, Cole. Thanks for having me.
As I mentioned, we're discussing the migrant crisis, as has been referred to. We're talking about illegal immigration into the United States of America. Dan, I want to start with you some and look at this from a national level. When we talk about immigration, a lot of times it's a focus on border states. This has been a problem for decades, but it has really ramped up here in recent years.
Yeah, it's really accelerated since President Joe Biden's inauguration in January 2021. Former President Donald Trump took a hard stance, a hard line on illegal immigration. Of course, he campaigned back in 2016 on building a border wall, ending illegal immigration, etc., and put in place some tough policies when it came to immigration. But when President Biden took office, he said his administration was going to take a more humane approach to immigration issues. He immediately stopped construction of Trump's border wall. He ended Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. That was a policy that allowed Border Patrol agents to require individuals who tried to cross the border to legally cross into the United States on asylum status or claiming asylum reasons, allowed border agents to return them to Mexico while they were going through the asylum process. Biden's administration ended that. Biden was perceived by many in Mexico and South America and Latin America as being softer or kinder to their cause. So more people attempted to come over during the early parts of his administration than they did to the Trump administration, when they had fears that they'd be jailed, sent immediately back to their home country, etc. So that all spiraled really into what we're talking about today. And we've had more than 10 million border crossers since President Biden took office, far and away more than the Trump administration or any other administration. Under President Biden's administration, we've been much more welcoming. We've released millions of people who have crossed the border, whether illegally or legally, into the United States communities. They've spread out across the country, and that's what's really led to this so-called migrant crisis in cities and states across America.
Dan, let me hop in here. Derek, you cover the Western United States, which obviously illegal immigration in general, is a much more impactful thing historically in the West than other parts of the country. Dan touched on this briefly. It's a national issue, but a lot of these migrants are coming in through Texas or these border states, and they're ultimately going to cities throughout the country.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Cole. And we, the Center Square, just reported over the weekend that there's an estimated 100,000 foreign nationals that have been sent to 6 different Democratic sanctuary cities. Mostly, it seems like through El Paso. The mayor of Denver has said that one of the reasons for that is it's just the cheapest bus ticket from El Paso is to Denver. So a lot of those migrants are showing up on buses in Denver. Denver had a pre-existing homeless problem, and now on top of that, you have migrants coming in, and that takes extra resources, something the city's been dealing with since at least December 2022.
Derek just referenced the number of buses coming from Texas and El Paso in particular. It's important to note here, many of these Democratic mayors and Democratic governors have been blaming Republican Texas Governor Greg Abbott for the migrant crisis in their communities. And yes, Greg Abbott, the Republican governor of Texas, did launch his busing strategy in 2022, where he started busing migrants that illegally crossed the border from Mexico into Texas to Washington, D.C., and then he started spreading the wealth out, for lack of a better term, to other sanctuary cities across the country. But it's important to note, too, that El Paso, which is one of the border cities in Texas that has been most inundated by border crossers into their communities, it's run by Democrats. It's a Democratic mayor, city council are Democrats. They've also launched the busing scheme shortly after Abbott, and they've been busing, as Derek mentioned, migrants to places where they say they want to go, Denver being one of those places. Derek mentioned the cheaper bus ticket there. So it is not just a Republican governor that's doing this. The Democratic mayor of El Paso and the city council there has been doing it, and before Abbott's busing strategy rolled out, the Biden administration was flying migrants all over the country. The facilities at the border where you normally house these folks, they're full. They've been full for a long time now. So it's not just the Republican governor of Texas.
Dan and Derek, you both mentioned the fact this busing strategy, as it was referred to, sending migrants to sanctuary cities. Sarah, let's go to you. You cover New York City is underneath your purview. So let's start with the most basic question on that. So when we say sanctuary city, what do we really mean when we say that?
Well, basically, it's been that, I feel like now it's kind of, under the Biden administration, sort of like the country has sort of become a sanctuary country in that sense. But sanctuary city is basically that, hey, you come here, you're not going to be sent away. And there's not going to be any recourse. We'll take care of you. In New York, one of the draws there was up until recently, New York had a right to shelter law. Actually, and neighboring Massachusetts has also the same sort of thing, which makes it sort of unique. Is that, hey, if you're here for 24 hours, we have to provide some sort of shelter. So that made New York even more attractive. And then also with some of the services they've been able to provide, basically, hey, we're welcoming you in, and we will provide all these services, not just sheltering, but just different social services as well. But it's now costing the city. And interestingly enough, Dan and Derek were touching on this. Eric Adams actually made a trip down to Central and South America recently, and basically said, hey, don't come to New York. Whereas before, hey, yeah, we'll take whoever. And now that's sort of changed. The tune has sort of changed. But yes, so sanctuary city it's kind of an all encompassing kind of a meaning, I think. And but yeah, it's now they're changing their tune.
We're hearing that from more places than just New York. Dan, you live right there around Chicago, Illinois. We're hearing this from Chicago as well, another self-proclaimed sanctuary city. What are we hearing out of Chicago?
Yeah, Chicago is one of the main cities that the migrants have been bused to. Even some planes have flown migrants to northern Illinois, not necessarily Chicago specifically, but then they've been bused, like a community like Rockford, which is west of Chicago, received a plane load of migrants over the holidays. They immediately put them on buses. They're not the size of Chicago, don't have the resources that Chicago has, put them on buses and sent them to Chicago. But Chicago is a sanctuary city. Illinois is actually officially a sanctuary state, but since more than 40,000 migrants have been bused to the state, mostly to the city of Chicago, it's draining resources. Chicago, between the city of Chicago government and state government, taxpayers that there both have spent almost $1 billion already on housing, food, healthcare. it just keeps, the amount of costs and services provided just keeps growing. And there are folks in Chicago now who are saying, hey, why are we a sanctuary city? We shouldn't be a sanctuary city. The mayor there, Brandon Johnson, continues his welcoming message. But he's declared a state of emergency at times. The Governor J.B. Pritzker, both Democrats, him and the Chicago mayor, has declared month after month a state of emergency in the state of Illinois. And what that essentially allows him to do, everybody remembers COVID when all these states of emergencies were being declared, it gives the governor more power to spend money, to make decisions that usually are legislatively made. So there's been pushback on the governor declaring states of emergency over the migrant crisis. But so far, Governor Pritzker and Mayor Daley in Chicago are sticking to their guns that they're going to be a welcoming sanctuary city, but it's really fraying nerves across the board.
And Derek, let's bring you in here. So another sanctuary city, Denver, Colorado. You mentioned homelessness, a major issue prior to this, migrant situation happening. Has the tone changed at all in Denver surrounding the sanctuary status where, in New York, you kind of have this backpedaling, in Chicago, you have doubled down. What's going on in Denver?
Not so much directly, saying, oh, we're not going to be a sanctuary city, but it's more admitting that there's a problem. And then reaching out to, say, the federal government to help resolve that problem, both from a funding perspective, but also a border perspective and securing the border. But the Denver's mayor has estimated that just in 2024 alone, the cost of migrants is an estimated 180 million this year. And, they've admitted that's not sustainable. And a think tank here called the Common Sense Institute broke that down. That equates to about $500 per Denver household that it's costing the city. Interesting numbers there that they crunched for us. So, yeah, and to go look beyond Denver, a group of mayors called the U.S. Conference of Mayors sent a letter end of last year to the federal government. There's 1.4 billion requests for the federal government's shelter and services program to fund that through Congress. And they're actually saying that it's going to take a lot more than that. Interesting. We had a big influx of COVID dollars for everything. And now that's obviously tapering down, but these local governments are coming forward and saying, hey, we got another issue and we need funding for that.
Sarah, you kind of talked about some of the issues in New York City as a whole, the taxpayer costs associated with those services. Dan, I believe you said in Chicago was...
It's approaching $1 billion, and that would be Chicago specifically, or Chicago City specifically, and the state of Illinois, because the state of Illinois is picking up healthcare costs, is giving money to Chicago for shelters and other costs. So combined between city of Chicago taxpayers and state of Illinois taxpayers, it's approaching $1 billion. And the legislature just went into session today. By the way, we're recording this on January 16th. And of course, it's winter here. We have sub-zero temperatures in my area. So these migrants often arrive, with no winter coats, no winter boots, etc. There's no place to put them. So it's become a humanitarian crisis, as well. But taxpayers are footing the bill, and I mentioned the legislature's back in session. We fully expect them to pass a supplemental spending bill for the current fiscal year they're in. Budget that was passed last spring is going to have to be updated because of all the costs.
Sarah, yeah, go ahead. New York City, that's got to be a big bill for them as well.
Oh, New York, it's been about over $1.5 billion, and they're estimating within the next 3 to 4 years, probably about $12 billion. That's what the city's estimating that it's going to be costing. And that's also the state as well has been pouring, Governor Hochul is trying to pour some money into the city because this was just a few weeks ago. Adams was threatening to cut several hundred million dollars from the city's budget, which would have affected public safety stuff. So NYPD, FDNY would have taken a cut. And then Governor Hochul came back in and said, hey, we're going to be going ahead and pouring some more money into the city's budget to kind of help offset that. So now he's sort of rescinded that. But so it's creeping into other parts and affecting, the public safety stuff as well, which is already which has already been drained there in the city.
Let's talk about that a little more. You mentioned, you and Dan both mentioned the overall cost of the city, but you include the state numbers as well. New York, Chicago, two major cities in the United States. How is the rest of the state of New York and really those rural communities in the upstate New York, what's their reaction?
So interestingly, there has been some infighting going back and forth. We haven't heard as much about it lately, but in this past year, so in order to sort of relieve some of the pressure in New York City, or I should say the metro area, the boroughs there and everything, the idea was, hey, okay, we should probably sort of send these migrants out into other smaller communities throughout the state in New York. And there were some smaller areas and cities that were like, oh no, we've got issues here. No, we're not sanctuary cities. We're not sanctuary towns. And so there was kind of some fighting back and forth between, like I said, New York City and just some of these other smaller areas that are like, no, we don't want them. We didn't invite them here. We weren't saying, hey, yeah, come here. So that has been an issue. And also just in the city and, and around the area, I mean, there's also a housing crisis issue, which is housing is expensive. So that's also added to that pressure.
Very similar dynamic in Chicago and the surrounding areas. Chicago has run out of room essentially as well. And Governor Pritzker, Illinois' governor, started asking suburban communities, hey, we'll give you however much of a grant if you can house so many of these migrants. And there was a little bit of interest early on, but not anymore. Most communities are rejecting that offer to the point too where, another thing, the city of Chicago started impounding these buses that were coming up from Texas, essentially taking the buses. And so the bus companies started dropping people off in the suburbs or in communities not Chicago. And these communities started passing ordinances. We are not a sanctuary city. We do not want migrants bused here. We have no resources to take care of them, etc. But when it happens, they're either sending the buses to Chicago or they're putting them on new buses and sending them to Chicago. So it's very similar dynamic to what's going on.
And we're recording this, Dan, I'm going to stick with you here. We're recording this on the heels of the Iowa caucus where you had voters come out and say their number one issue in Iowa was immigration. Iowa is not exactly a border state. It's in the general Midwest, much like Illinois. Why does it seem like these, I would say more rural voters and what I would say the heartland of America, generally flyover states is what they consider it, they're concerned about immigration? Why is that?
One thing I'll echo, I think, what Republican presidential candidate and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has said in the past is every state is a border state under the current crisis. In addition to people flooding the border, illegal drugs are flooding the border. Fentanyl has become a major concern across the country. Mexican cartels send people over the border, the southern border, into the United States with loads of fentanyl, and they get distributed across the country. They don't stay in Texas and Arizona and Southern California. Those drugs make their way across the country. And we've seen a significant spike in fentanyl overdoses and fentanyl deaths just about in every state in the country. So that's one reason. But then, the Republican candidates, of course, are making an issue of this. And since the busing strategy, but from Governor Abbott and others, is now well underway, it's raised awareness. So Governor Abbott really has accomplished what his intent was, is people were only saying, it's a border problem. It's not my problem. Since Abbott's been sending, and not just Abbott, everyone focuses on Abbott, but El Paso's mayor and even the Biden administration did it. Since these illegal border crossers are flooding communities elsewhere, people are more aware of the situation. You referenced the poll in Iowa at the Center Square. We just conducted a poll in January, just a couple of weeks ago, and the two top concerns for more than 2,500 people who were surveyed across the country, the number one concern was continued inflation. Everything costs more. Everybody worries about what they can afford for their family, et cetera. The number two concern was the border crisis and the migrant crisis across the country.
And Derek, relative to the other two here on the call, Sarah in the Northeast, Dan in the Midwest, you're out in the West. Do you foresee this easing anytime soon? Is there a light at the end of the proverbial tunnel here?
Unfortunately, not that I can see. Even Democrats here are pointing to the border and the border needing to be secure. But to go off your point too, it is spreading just from Denver too. There's one of the mountain towns, I think it's Carbondale, out on the western slope. In December, it was reported over 100 migrants over a few months had arrived there. And the mountain towns in Colorado were already having a housing crisis, not enough housing. The housing that was available was very expensive. So again, those migrants going to those smaller towns that don't have those housing resources, it's put those local governments in a pinch out there too. So it's definitely spreading beyond Denver. And I think, unfortunately, we'll keep seeing that happen here.
Sarah, obviously New York City, largest city in the United States. I'm going to give you the final word here. Interesting lessons to be learned from what's been happening in New York City, very far away from the southern border. With your reporting, what have you kind of seen that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
It's very, very interesting. I think the thing that is most telling is that there seems to be regret, buyer's remorse, certainly on part of Mayor Eric Adams there. All the stuff that, yes, these mayors and some of these politicians have been saying before, now they're having to, they sort of, hey, they made their bed and now they have to sort of lie in it, and they're seeing it. And I think it's very telling that, as I mentioned before, about how they're going down and saying, hey, no more, we can't take any more people, and really shifting the blame at, oh yeah, hey, but blaming the border states, blaming Texas and Abbott and everything. I think it's a very interesting thing, but everything that they have said, before, it's like, okay, well, now they're not sort of living up to their promises and they're trying to take it back. So I think it's very interesting. And also it's hurting sort of the areas where there's the voters too. It's coming back on them. People who've been supportive of that are now in these areas that it's affecting them as far as crime goes, panhandling, the schools, all those sort of things. It's starting to hurt them, and also financially, it's going to hurt them, their pockets too, and it's sort of putting pressure on them as well. So it's just very interesting to kind of see and all this stuff unfold.
Well, you can read all of this reporting and more at thecentersquare.com. Sarah, Dan, Derek, thank you so much for joining us on America's Talking today. And thank you, listeners at home, for listening to this episode of America's Talking. You can find more episodes at americastalking.com, and you can check out all of our other great America's Talking Network productions at americastalking.com. Until next time, thank you very much for listening to America's Talking.